Hello again. Thanks for tuning in to the Focus on Photography with Rusty Brown podcast. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day. Today's topic is why manual mode matters. I'm going to talk about that a little bit and hopefully shed a little bit of light on it. But before I get into the bullet points that I have that I want to go over, I want to first tell you why manual mode matters to me. Quite simply, it lets me achieve whatever creative vision I have for that particular shot. Some would say it allows you to cheat, meaning depending on the photographer that you talk to, there are all these rules about photography that we must follow in terms of focal length and distance and lighting and rule of third and et cetera, et cetera. And they're all sound principles, but I don't believe that we have to follow them to the letter. And for me, manual mode lets me dial in whatever I want to dial in, regardless of what the rule says. So I may take one setting higher than conventional wisdom says it should be, or lower, or some combination of that. So I want to first, like I said, just reiterate the point. Manual mode matters to me because it allows me to achieve my vision with any particular shot. Okay. So as we get into this, I'm going to show a couple of visuals. If you're only listening and not watching, it's okay. Drop me a line. These visuals that I'm showing today are handouts that I use as part of the RBP 52 photo group. It's just me and some friends that get together and we try to become better photographers. And I have a section in our OneDrive of not necessarily training aids, but some nice reference material. And in this case, the things that I'm going to be showing today are there. So if you would like one of these, please feel free to drop me a line. I can email you that or give you a direct link to where we have it on our shared OneDrive. Okay, so I recently dropped a video on my photography YouTube channel. That's Rusty Brown Photography, that details how to store a group of settings under a single button using a feature called memory recall. Part of the basis of understanding much of that video assumes a core knowledge of why manual mode matters, because basically mastery of manual mode is dependent on fully understanding the exposure triangle. In that video, I used the pop quiz to kind of help my viewers shake the dust off, as it were, regarding the exposure triangle. I'm going to share that quiz with you in a little bit. But I realized as I was going through that quiz that not everyone is comfortable with the exposure triangle and how to manipulate it to get the exposure you need, or the perfect exposure for every shot. So, I don't want to assume any knowledge level with regards to that. And I can tell you quite honestly, for me, understanding the exposure triangle took a while because some of it just didn't make sense to me. But through practice and repetition, I got it down. And now hopefully I can help you do the same. So I'm just going to break down the exposure triangle and show you how to leverage manual mode to nail any exposure. So what I'm going to put up first, I'm going to put up on the screen just a visual of what the exposure triangle looks like in a graphical triangle form. So I'm going to start with that, but then I'm going to put up another graphic that basically separates each one of them, but that won't be in triangle form. But because we're talking about the exposure triangle, I thought this would be a good one to start with, right? So the exposure triangle consists of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Each of these can alter, change, or impact your exposure. So knowing what each one does specifically should help you decide, how and when to alter them. ISO is your camera's sensor's sensitivity to light, right? So your camera has a sensor in it and it is sensitive to light. ISO impacts that sensitivity. A lower ISO is less sensitive to light, while a higher ISO is more sensitive to light, and generally used when the environment you're shooting in is too dark. Low ISOs provide clean, sharp, high quality images, while pushing your ISO too high introduces what's known as digital noise. It can look like grain in your images. The amount of noise depends on your camera and its sensor size. The smaller the sensor, the shorter range you have to expand that ISO. The bigger the sensor, the more you can push ISO out to a larger number. Shutter speed. This refers to the amount of time your camera's sensor is exposed to light, and is measured in fractions of a second. For example, 1/125th, 1/500th, 1/640th, etc. Slower shutter speeds keep the shutter open longer, letting in more light, while faster shutter speeds open and close faster, thus letting in less light. Faster shutter speeds freeze action or motion, whereas slower shutter speeds can introduce blur to your motion. Then there's aperture. Aperture refers to the size of the opening inside your lens, and it's measured in what we call f-stops. So, if you're looking at the graphic, the aperture along the bottom you see there, the size of the opening varies depending upon what that aperture is, and those are called f-stops. A low aperture, right, has a wider opening, letting in more light, and a high, narrow aperture, right, makes for a much sharper image by keeping more of the scene in sharp focus. Let's talk about stops for a second, right? Stops and aperture. This is where most people get confused. I know I did. So let's demystify it right here, right? So a stop refers to the doubling or halving, to double or cut in half the amount of light that makes up an exposure. So to add or change a stop of light, we can use either of the three pillars of the triangle. Either one of them, ISO, shutter speed, or aperture, can all get you changes in your light by one stop, incremental stops, multiple stops, etc. More times than not, changing one pillar of the exposure triangle forces us to change another one. Or sometimes we even have to change both of the other pillars, right? As an example, if you increase your shutter speed to compensate for capturing very fast action, like sports, but don't change either your ISO or aperture, your image could be too dark or too soft, or both. To that end, there are literally hundreds of different combinations you can use to adjust or change the number of stops needed for your perfect exposure. Now, I put an emphasis on your, because that's kind of what I was talking about at the start of the podcast when I said, why this was important to me, because, your shot is what's important here, right? There are modes on your camera that can do some of the work for you, right? We know about some of these. So Aperture Priority will focus mainly on aperture and thus automatically adjust your shutter speed, okay? Shutter Priority will focus mainly on shutter speed and thus automatically adjust your aperture. Now, this can be good, but the problem with using one of the camera's pre-adjusted modes is that the camera doesn't know what you're shooting. It's only going to balance the exposure mathematically based on what you chose as the priority. So if you chose shutter as the priority, it's going to balance it on aperture. If you chose aperture as the priority, it's going to balance it on shutter. But if you're shooting something that may need to be more tack sharp or may need to really, really freeze the action, the camera won't know that. And while it will render you a properly exposed image, the result of the image may not have the look you want. Therefore, the combination you choose for your shot, again, your shot, should be dependent on your artistic vision for that image, right? And only you know what that vision looks like. Trusting the camera to make that decision for you I think is risky, right? I think to turn over that level of trust, especially if it's a critically important shot for you, is risky. You may get it. It might get it right. It does happen. It does happen for sure. But I know that if you're in manual mode and you dial in each of these settings yourself, you're guaranteed to get it right. Let me put up the other. For the rest of the conversation, I'm going to put up the other graphic. Bear with me a sec. Okay, so what I have on the screen now, for those of you that are just listening and not watching, is something that's called the photography cheat sheet. And so it's not in a triangle, but it's breaking down everything in a left to right fashion. If you start from the bottom, it's showing you what exposure looks like. Perfect exposure is right in the middle. Underexposed is to the left. Overexposed is to the right. And then on top of that, you see ISO. And it tells you what low ISO gives you on the left, like with sunny and outdoors. And it tells you what high ISO gives you on the right, where you have, not much light to work with. Above ISO, you see shutter speed, and it shows you that the longer exposure, meaning that the shutter is open longer, is down on the left, and the shorter exposures, or the faster ones, are down on the right. And then there's aperture, which is usually always depicted with a visual that shows you a circle, and the opening, the size of the opening varies. So obviously at f2.8, that is, one end of the aperture spectrum, it's wide open. There are lenses that get, much wider open than f2.8, but for the purpose of today's conversation, let's go with that. And you're going to have a blurry background, probably. You're not going to get the whole shot, especially if it's environmental at f2.8. The other end of that spectrum is f22. And if you see, it's a very, very narrow opening there. Just a small amount of light's going to get through there. So as you look at these, I want you to start thinking about things like, what if? What if, for example, you're at f16, which is a fairly stop down or closed aperture, but you're also at, ISO 800 and let's say a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. Based on your scenario and where you are, that could be good or it could be bad, and you may have to adjust some of those things. So you want to look at each one individually and understand their responsibility in that respective pillar, what exactly it is that aperture does and doesn't do, what exactly it is that shutter speed does and doesn't do, and the same for ISO, right? So I mentioned the pop quiz that I used on the YouTube video from the other day. So I'm going to show you that now. I just want to qualify it and say, if you're one of the people that follow me on Rusty Brown Photography, thank you. And if you've seen that video, don't cheat. Do not tell your classmates about this quiz. It's just a quiz, but it's going to give me an opportunity to hopefully give you a really good example of why we need to really understand our exposure triangle. So let me launch the quiz. Okay, so I'm going to preface it by giving you the same example that I gave on my YouTube video. Assume that you are at a 2-hour event. You're the photographer, and you're photographing a child's birthday party outside at a park. Say 10-year-olds, right? Everything's going well. You're halfway through the 2-hour shoot when big cloud rolls in, changes the lighting. Now, it's not dangerous. There's no thunder, no rain. The kids are still playing. But now you have a much darker environment, but you're still on the clock. You have an hour left to shoot. So keep that in mind as you look at the quiz. This is the scenario. You're taking photos at ISO 200 and 1/500th of a second. The image now is exactly 2 stops underexposed, again, because of what happened with the clouds. Which of the following adjustments would result in a perfectly exposed image? You ready? Open the aperture to f2.8. Increase the ISO to 800. C, slow the shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. Or D, increase the ISO to 400 and slow the shutter speed to 1/250th of a second. Now, when you look at these, before you pick one, This is how you start to begin to understand how stops work. Looking at the first one, to open the aperture to f2.8, that is what? That is half of 5.6, right? So that is your two stops. So 5.6, if you took it down one stop, that would take you to f4.0. You take it down a second stop, you get to f2.8. So that's how you have to start thinking about that. Looking at the ISO, we were at 200, right? To double something is one stop. If we doubled the ISO from 200, it gives us one stop, which would be 400. So in option B, increasing the ISO to 800 would get us two stops. Then if you look at option C, we were shooting at 1/500th of a second, right? So if we were to decrease that by one stop, which would be half, we would be at 1/250th of a second. But to get to the second stop, we have to go to 1/125th of a second. And then what option D gives you is a combination to get to two stops using two different things. And this is how the exposure triangle works. So you can increase your ISO to 400, which is one stop, and you can slow your shutter speed to 1/250th of a second, which is also one stop, thus giving you two stops. So when you begin to think in terms of, I don't have to solve my exposure challenges with just one pillar of the triangle, that's when you know you're starting to put it together, because there are clearly going to be instances where you're going to favor one of the pillars over the other. You ready for the answer? You've had a chance to think about it. Here we go. All of the above are correct, because that kind of led right into the answer. Everything that's on the screen will give you two stops of light. But where we're going to get a little more specific here now is in how or what situation at this kid's party would one of these be better than the other. All right. So look at it this way. I can tell you, for example, if I'm the photographer and I'm in that environment, and let's say, for example, they're playing a game, kickball. That's a good example. And the birthday boy, is at the plate and he's running up to kick a ball, and it's going to go beyond second base into the outfield. He's excited. He's having a great day. He just turned 10. I am not going to choose option C, which was to slow the shutter speed to 1/125th. If we were already at 1/500th of a second, I know that that's a fast enough shutter speed to capture a 10-year-old kicking a ball. I'll get the expression of the face. I'll get the action of the kick. I'll get the ball in flight. They will all be good, right? Secondly, I'm not going to open the aperture to f2.8. We were already at 5.6. Keeping in mind, before the big cloud rolled in, those settings were prime. We were at the perfect exposure to capture that action. If we drop that aperture to f2.8, now we're going to have a blurry image. It's going to be too soft, right? So in this particular example that now I've given you a little more context of playing kickball, for me, I'm just going to increase the ISO to 800 because I have a full frame sensor. Going from ISO 200 to ISO 800 is nothing. It guarantees me that I still have a sharp image with that aperture of 5.6, and it guarantees me that I can freeze the ball, stop any action from that kickball game. Now you take the same party and say it's 10 minutes later, the game is over, and now everyone's at the picnic table and they're singing happy birthday, and the guest of honor is about to blow out the candle. In a case like that, I might go with, option D, using two elements of the pillar to make the adjustment, right? Increase that ISO to 400, slow the shutter speed down to 1/250th of a second, because now the only action moving, right, is the individual blowing out the candles. Everyone's there. It's static. It's not a fast moving type of shot. You could even play around with doing some things with the aperture if you want the act of blowing out the candles to show that motion and be slightly blurry. You can play with those. So if there were a choice on the quiz that said It depends on the situation. That answer would be correct also, because it does. And that's the way you have to think. You could use any one of them as I presented them and get to 2 stops. But would your image look like trash, right? You need to know the situation. Again, going back to what I said about choosing one of those modes that the camera gives you, like aperture priority or shutter priority. Even worse, my opinion, automatic mode. You are basically telling the camera, figure it out for me. And when you do, it's going to balance out those things so that when you look at your exposure meter, it's going to register as perfect. But that image may be too soft. That image may be not necessarily out of focus, but it won't capture the action in the way that you want to capture it. I mean, that's why you were hired to shoot this event, because you know how to read the situation. That's the takeaway here. It depends is always going to be the answer, in my opinion. Whether you're in the studio, whether you're at a sporting event like a no fooling sporting event, where you really have to slow something down. It depends, and it also depends on the light source. Are you shooting at a middle school gym where the light's going to be trash and the white balance is going to be awful? Are you shooting at a professional arena where the light balance is going to be a constant 5,600 Kelvin? It matters, but think in terms of pillars. Shutter speed does what? Aperture does what? ISO does what? And then balance those, right, based on the situation that you're in. And the easiest way to do that is to be in manual mode. There are times, where aperture priority or shutter priority are really good choices. And if you check out that video that I mentioned earlier, the memory recall settings, you could build an entire bank of settings for a particular type of shoot. And it could include one of the priority modes in there. I've done that before. But to understand how, or more importantly, when to use one of the priority modes, I think we first have to understand manual mode, right? And manual mode is totally dependent on understanding the exposure triangle. So like the example in the quiz, try different variables in the triangle just to see the result. Go out and do some practicing where all you do is, no matter what you have to do to make a change, only do it with ISO. See what happens. At least at a minimum, you'll get to know what is the maximum you can push your camera's ISO to. You need to know that. It's like I have this thing with me when I'm with my cars. I need to know what true empty is, not what the gauge says is empty, because they don't always get it right. So I typically try to get as close as I can, so I know in my mind when I really am pushing empty. Well, the same thing holds true here. If you just go out and practice and say, you know what, for the next week, when I got to make an adjustment, like I'm going to start with these base settings, but from that point forward, when I have to make an adjustment, I'm only going to do shutter speed, period. What happens? Or I'm only going to do aperture, period. What happens? Or ISO. And then you will learn from the results. I mean, the results may look like trash, or they may look good. You can say, hey, you know what? I'm super comfortable going up to ISO 3200 without blinking. And getting to know that is going to be a huge part of your success story, right? Some people have a thing where they say which pillar should be the first adjustment based on what we're shooting, right? So like some people will say, no matter what, I try not to adjust my ISO beyond blank, or I really don't want to open up that shutter speed anything lower than, I think my personal one is I don't tend to go any lower than 1/125th. It depends on the shooting though, right? But again, this experimentation is going to help us to understand how we shoot, and a proper exposure depends on what it is that we're doing, right? Spend some time in manual mode. Get good at it to the point where it's second nature. And it doesn't matter the type of photo you're taking. If you can do that photo and you can set it all up in manual, then you're really going to crush the priority modes, aperture or shutter. We talked about the importance of knowing our cameras, right? Like I think it was the first, maybe second episode of this podcast. And if you're jumping into automatic or program or one of the other priority modes because you don't understand the exposure triangle, it will come back to bite you at some point. So now is the time to take a little time and just try to peel that onion just a little bit more. And then once you've mastered that exposure triangle in manual mode, feel free to use Aperture or Shutter Priority. Knowing how to expose properly in manual mode and understanding stops is a huge part of our total success. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Like I said, if you'd like any of the reference materials that I showed on the screen today, drop me a line, rusty@rustybrownphotography.com. I'll be glad to send you a copy if you want to, level up your understanding of the exposure triangle and level up your experience and confidence in shooting in manual mode. I appreciate you, and I'm glad that you chose to stop by the Focus on Photography podcast. We'll talk to you guys next time. Cheers.